the last 40 years of presidents of the United States all have had this economic theory in common, except for one. Paul, can you guess what that economic theory is?
I'm going to go out on a limb here and say it's trickle-down economics.
Yes, it is. That's right. Here's the deal. Trickle-down economics has pretty much governed the way that presidents from both parties have governed the economy of the country. And not just here, it's actually been all around the world. Lots of countries have adopted this. Of course, Thatcher was famous in the 80s. Reaganomics were famous in the 80s. But what often gets lost is that presidents from both parties did this. And it was also the case that Tony Blair pursued very similar trickle-down policies as Bill Clinton and Barack Obama. We'll get to the exception, but I'm going to save that for a second. Why don't we try to define what trickle-down economics is? It's got three basic parts, Paul. Mm-hmm. The one that everybody seems to know is tax cuts for the rich.
That's right.
Good for the economy. That's the whole trickle-down part. Mm-hmm. Somehow, if I give a rich person a tax cut, that is going to trickle down to me. But the other two pieces of it are really important, which is, number two, it really is about deregulating the powerful. So limiting the regulations that are on powerful companies, corporations, and people. That's a very important part of it. So that also is the idea that if I deregulate the powerful, that benefits are going to somehow trickle down to you. And the third thing is that really everybody else should be paid very little wages, which of course, somehow this is all going to work out. So really wage suppression is a huge part of this. This is about letting the market decide what you are worth. And if you get decided what you're worth by the market, you are worth it. So you shouldn't complain. So those are the three big ones. Paul, what has this led to in most of our economy here in the United States or across the world?
Well, I mean, it's worked out pretty much as planned, right? The rich people got tax cuts and minimum wages were kept artificially low. The federal minimum wage is still $7.25 an hour. Deregulation is run rampant. And so basically, a study from Rand from a couple of years ago has found that the top 1% of Americans in terms of wealth have taken $50 trillion from the bottom 90% of the economy over the last 40 years. So, I mean, that's just a staggering number. That is literally a number that is too big for you to actually comprehend how big it is. But all those policies have amounted to $50 trillion being taken out of the paychecks of the bottom 90% of the economy. And if you're hearing this, odds are very good that you are in that 90%.
Yeah, and there's a very famous chart that's gotten floated around about a break between productivity and wages. And that break happened right about the middle of the 70s, which was right about when trickle-down economics became the dominant way of making policy. And what ended up happening was it used to be that when you produced more for your hour, you got paid more. That seems like a pretty good deal. Now, it's actually you're producing more for your hour, but those are not going to wages. It's going to profits, compensation for corporations and their executives and shareholders. It's really no longer coming down. So actually, the trickle down got broke. Like it just didn't trickle down to anybody. Here's what I want to make sure that people understand, though. We often hear about trickle down economics being associated with Reagan or Thatcher, but the truth is, this was something that infected both parties. And in fact, Jimmy Carter was the first really deregulation president that we had since the New Deal, right? Before the New Deal, there were a lot of bad actors, but Jimmy Carter came around and did a lot of deregulating. Then Reagan came in and did a lot of tax cutting. But here's the thing, you may remember Bill Clinton famously, of course, gave that speech in which he said the era of big government is over. And then he went on to pass welfare reform. He ended up passing all his deregulations of banks. And we know that most of what his policies were very Wall Street friendly. And needless to say, prior to that, he was the person who passed NAFTA. So there's a lot of trickle-down economics built into his programming. And then there, of course, was George W. Bush, maybe the king of the modern trickle-down era, with his massive tax cuts and massive deregulation that ended up getting us into massive deficits and the great economic recession. So you would think that Barack Obama came along and maybe tried to do something different, but I hate to tell you, he also was a neoliberal trickle-downer. He surrounded himself with Wall Street characters, people from the Clinton era, and ultimately his policies looked an awful lot like any other trickle-down person. He didn't cut taxes, but he did let the market reign, pursued a lot of free trade agreements, really did a lot to harm labor during this time. Labor was on a great decline. And what Paul was talking about earlier with wages being flat and all of that money going to the top 10%, that was accelerated under Obama, not slowed down. So we get to Trump. And of course, Trump, he was ideologically confused in most ways. But the one thing that he did get done as a piece of policy was pass a massive tax cut and pursue deregulations. And we know what ended up happening with that is we had created a really fragile economy that when the pandemic hit, we had a really fragile economy. Most people didn't have enough money in their bank account to weather that storm. And of course, we had flat wages for a really long period of time. Fat cats got fatter. And ultimately we still had these same trends going. So trickle-down economics is a thread that runs through all of these presidencies, basically every single one of them for 40 years. Paul, am I right?
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. It's, I mean, part of the reason why we took so long to recover from the Great Recession, maybe even didn't recover fully from the Great Recession by the time the pandemic started, was because of Obama's policies, which, enabled Wall Street to recover without the rest of the American economy. And as you know, like the true economic strength of this country comes in workers' paychecks and workers' spending, which is the thing that President Biden understands that the other presidents for the last 40 years have not understood.
Yeah. And in fact, he has specifically rejected this. If you listen to the things he says about the economy in his State of the Union and when he's given specific economic speeches, he says the era of trickle-down economics is over. And he's pretty clear that era included his former boss, President Obama, and Bill Clinton. And of course, he was a senator through a lot of this time. He's even, I think, in some ways reflecting on his own policy pursuits and that really recognizing that this did not work for working people. So the new era that we're entered into is something where it's about asking the wealthy to pay their fair share. So increasing their taxes. It's about proper regulations and high standards for the powerful to make sure that they don't abuse their power and that they're actually making positive contributions to the Commonwealth. And of course, it's about centering workers. That is probably the most important point, that wages matter, workers matter, that our policies should be aimed at lifting people up. And as the president says, it should be about building the economy from the bottom up and the middle out, not the top down. That's really incredible. And that is a massive departure. Really, we're talking 40 plus years, massive departure from two different parties. I mean, from multiple parties in these presidencies. Paul, what do you think?
I think it's hard to understate how important this is, right? And like our viewers might not agree with every single one of Biden's policies, but I think it's really important to acknowledge that this is groundbreaking in terms of economics. We've had both sides agreeing. It's just a matter of twisting the dial and seeing how big the tax cuts for the rich get, between Republican and Democratic presidents. But this time, the Biden administration has brought on a lot of really smart economic thinkers who understand that workers' paychecks are what matter most, right? Like there was a recent conversation about trade. And to hear a presidential economist say that they think that it's not just enough to bring down prices when you import things, but you also want to make sure that wages are going up too. That is groundbreaking, right? Like for those 20 years of NAFTA and things like that, where we were importing cheap stuff, nobody ever thought well, what happens if all the workers who are getting laid off in factories in America can't afford to buy this stuff, right? And that's part of the economic decay we've seen over the last 40 years. So it's just tremendous to see people actually calling out trickle down on its bullshit, so that we can start to rebuild the economy from the middle out and the bottom up, as Biden is very fond of saying.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think in one way to think about this is that Biden is our first truly post-Reagan president. Mm-hmm. Every other president was trapped inside of Reagan's ideological worldview about the purpose of policy and how to design an economy. Biden's the first post-Reagan president. It's pretty remarkable. Now, some of that is, of course, he's also the first pre-Reagan president. This is an area where his age actually helps him. He grew up in an era that worked under different assumptions about what the purpose of policy was, the purpose of government, and the purpose of the economy. It actually was a New Deal era. He's been in Washington, D.C. so long, a lot of his mentors were literal New Deal architects, people that were in the Senate writing the New Deal. They were young pups then, and then a young pup in Biden came in the 70s. But it's very interesting because I think he absolutely is calling back to a different era where we centered working people, where government was on your side to give you a hand up, and where you used policy to improve the lives of people and grow the economy. I think those are really, really important points. And it'd be very interesting to see how it casts forward as we look at the coming election and more policy making. All right. There you go. We've got 40 years of trickle-down economics interrupted by this new president, the first post-Reagan president in Biden.